All right, welcome into another edition of the HoosierIllustrated.com Indiana basketball postgame wrap-up show. John Alden from In Touch with Indiana Sports and basketball recruiting analyst Kyler Staley are with you this evening. Pretty late right now, of course, almost 10:30. Late tip, 8 p.m. Hoosiers get the or take the L, I should say, 85-68 to the Nebraska Cornhuskers, falling to 1-1 in the conference, 8-3 overall. In a game that, at least to me, Kyler, I felt like we had seen, this game kind of play out in ways we had seen before, at least when it comes to when Indiana faces Nebraska. And I don't want to talk about that too much, but the short version of how this game played out, in case you didn't see the entire thing, Nebraska gets off to a really fast start. Indiana responds very well. And then from that point forward, Indiana and Nebraska are basically trading offense, whether it be three-pointers, good looks down low. Miles Rice had a hell of a game overall, especially in the second half. And then you get to the late portions of the game, and all of a sudden, Indiana starts to struggle more defensively. And then there's all of a sudden a lid on the basket as well. Didn't matter if it was shots down low, threes were no longer falling. From basically the 4 or 5 minute on to the end of the game, it just, Kyler, you said this before we started recording. Indiana ran out of gas. And I don't think Indiana necessarily did anything wrong, at least when it comes to what they were trying to do offensively. Now, defensively, that's a different story. But I think, and I'll quit rambling and hand things off to you, but I think Indiana did a lot of good things tonight. They just weren't able to sustain some of the offensive decisions, if you will, throughout the entirety of the game, because they kind of went to a different style of offense tonight.
Yeah. And, the 85-68 score, is what it is. That's going to be final and whatnot. That does not show what this type of game was. And you touched on it just briefly. Nebraska had that hot start, punched Indiana. Indiana did a really, really good job of responding. And honestly, this game, it felt like for the majority of the middle portions of it, it just felt like a game of mini runs. Honestly, Nebraska would get on their run, Indiana would get on their run. Just nobody was really able to just close us out until about the final 4 minutes of the game. And Indiana goes on the final 3 minutes, they went on a scoring drought. And really, when you're just watching this game and it's that shootout of a game, it's on the road in a pretty underrated, hostile environment, I would say. It's a pretty tough place to play there at Nebraska. You just knew that if Indiana didn't figure things out on the defensive end in this game, it was not going to be pretty, and they were not going to win this game. That's exactly what happened. They let up too many defensive, what should I say? They just lapsed a little bit on defense too many times. I'll say it that way. Foul trouble was a big key in this. At halftime, you had 4 players with 2 fouls at least. And then honestly, you look at, Nebraska's not really a team that will, but will not really shoot the ball. They only shot the ball 14 times, similar to how Indiana is. They play in the paint. They want to get to the paint. And when you got like Malik Renew, who picks up 2 fouls, 3 fouls or whatever, and Mike Woodson, we got to play Malik. You got to play him. And you see that he's timid, a little timid when it comes to defending the paint, and you're just allowing Nebraska to get easy looks. It's just not a recipe of success, honestly. And obviously, Mackenzie Mbako gets his fouls early. He was gone the first half, so who knows what that would have changed or whatnot. But mainly the thing that I watched out of this game, it's just Indiana's got to figure out on the defensive end. They've absolutely got to figure out on the defensive end, because if they would have gotten a few stops here and there in this game when it really mattered, I think Indiana wins this game. I really do, because I've said it all along. This offense for Indiana, it's there. It really is there. They have so many pieces to work with on the offensive end. It's just about clicking on the defensive end. And until they figure it out, it could be a long season, and they're going to be in these types of shootout games. But they've got to clamp down on the defensive end, and they've got to figure out ways to, be successful and set themselves up for success on that end, or else you're just going to have games like this where it's going to be shootouts, and especially on the road in the Big Ten, that's just going to be really, really tough to overcome.
One thing that, and I know I mentioned earlier that they kind of played a different style of game, at least offensively today. One thing that I was kind of confused about down the stretch, and again, I don't think Indiana necessarily did anything wrong here, because a lot of the shots that they were missing, especially from deep, they were good looks. But one thing that kind of puzzled me was once those shots began to not really fall as much as they were, why did Indiana choose to not try to go back down low to Malik Renew and Umar Bala? And they were getting shots down low. They were usually off of missed three-pointers, but even then they were missing those bunnies, the layups, or they'd get fouled and then they'd try to shoot a couple of free throws. It felt like no matter what shots were being taken, there was just a lid on the basket. But we didn't really see hardly any of Umar Bala in the second half, I feel like, at least from an offensive standpoint.
Yeah, definitely from an offensive standpoint, he was a little quiet here. I honestly think to kind of, from my point of view, answering this question, I think it's just how Nebraska was, their defensive system was obviously to double team Malik Renew, double team Umar Ballo and get that. And they were honestly a team that wants you to shoot the three ball. They really did force Indiana to put up, what was the final?
35 three-pointers is their most since 2016.
Which is crazy. So that goes back all that far because Indiana, 8 of 35, this is what people wanted, right? They wanted Indiana to shoot the ball. They wanted Indiana to shoot the ball 35, 40 times a game. In this situation, it's kind of proved you wrong there in that type of sense because not necessarily that's going to work all the time.
What's crazy, too, I want to continue on this. At one point, they were 5 for 9 from three-point range. And this was, of course, early in the first half. So I think part of the issue here was Indiana got so confident, those who were making three-pointers, Luke Goody, Trey Galloway, whoever it may have been, that once you see a couple fall, you're almost not afraid to keep shooting them. And that's not a bad thing. I think that's part of why you saw Indiana be a little more reliant. Even though that was part of Nebraska's game plan, I don't think Indiana was scared of that being the case necessarily.
Yeah, and you also got to throw in the fact that one of arguably their best three-point shooter, other than Luke Goody, was also on the bench a whole lot. So that obviously doesn't help them. And McKenzie and Baco is who I'm talking about. Obviously, that doesn't help them when it comes to consistently knocking down the three ball. But honestly, I think just Indiana just kind of in a way just fell into Nebraska's kind of trap, I guess, in a little ways, because like I mentioned, Nebraska wanted them to shoot the three ball. They wanted to do that. They were going to double team the big guys. They weren't going to let them get easy looks. And they were just going to force them to make shots. And unfortunately, they just didn't make enough shots when it comes to three. But, I do like that they are shooting that three ball. I really do like it because then they're not passing up 3-point shots. I mean, Trey Galloway went 3 of 9. I mean, he shot the ball. No hesitation. Luke Goody obviously is just finding his rhythm as well. And then also, I mean, I feel like we got to talk about it before it gets overlooked. But Miles Rice, man, coming in and really just taking over the game. I think at one point he had 13 straight points and just really putting the team on his back. That is the type of Miles Rice that Indiana needs really bad, and he needs it consistently. And Mike Woodson's got to let Miles Rice do his thing a lot of the times because I do think that there have been a little bit of a handcuff situation with Miles Rice. I think Mike Woodson wants his point guards to run a certain way. Miles Rice used to being the guy, at Washington State, comes in, he's trying to figure out what his role is and trying to figure out what he needs to do to make this team successful. Right then and there, when he's in his bag like that and he's scoring and he's creating for himself, that opens up the offense a ton there. So I'm hoping that you can build off of that, and I'm hoping that you start seeing consistent performances like that with Miles Rice and Woodson just allowing him to go out there and do this thing.
One other player I want to ask you about, Kanan Carlisle, came off the bench, and he was pretty much a non-factor. And it felt like to me that anytime Kanan Carlisle tried to do anything or create anything, he was just kind of in the wrong place at the wrong time, not really making the best of decisions. What do you think was kind of his issue tonight?
I think it's just continuing for him to just find his role in a lot of ways. For me, I think you're going to see this a lot with Kanan Carlisle this year. And it's not really his fault in a lot of ways. I think it's just the depth of this team, just the balance of this team. I think there's going to be games where he pops off like he did versus Minnesota, and there's going to be games where he just kind of struggles to kind of find himself in a rhythm. And, honestly, that kind of is what it is. So you hope that, players like Trey Galloway, like Miles Rice, and McKenzie and Baco especially, those guys step up and, can kind of do their thing. So that way, if Kanan Carlisle does have an off night, that it doesn't affect a whole lot. But I would throw him and Bryson Tucker, obviously two guys that we were praising in Minnesota. I thought tonight they were just a little bit off tonight, a lot off, not even a little bit. I thought Bryson Tucker had some freshman moments out there, was just kind of forcing it a little bit too much, taking some very off-balance shots when he didn't need to. But at the same time, he was being aggressive, and you want to see that from a freshman as well. So can't knock him too much on there. But man, it's just frustrating because when you watch that game, Indiana did fight. It wasn't the fight shouldn't be questioned at all. And if you're questioning their fight, then you're watching the wrong game. You're just looking for excuses to be mad about it. I thought this team fought, and it just comes down to the defensive end, and it's all mental. They've got to figure out a defensive plan that works, and they've got to stick to that plan, and they just got to be a little bit more consistent on that end. And one thing I do also want to point out too, Mackenzie Mbako, I know he picked up 2 fouls right off the bat, and Mike Woodson had the benching, but we got to see Mackenzie Mbako be a lot more consistent moving forward, because him just kind of having games where he disappears like that when he really, really needs to be Indiana's best player, it's just not – there's just no more excuses in my opinion anymore. He's got to figure it out. He's got to be more disciplined on the defensive end and just, having a better motor, honestly. That's what it is. So there's a lot to build off of this game. I'll say that. There's a lot to build off. It is tough because you do get your first loss in Big Ten play, but they got 2 more games before the non-conference slate is over. Then they're back in the Big Ten. Take care of business with those games. Go back into the Big Ten play and just start finding ways to win ball games. I think this team's going to still figure it out. There's still a lot of season left, but really just got to focus on the defensive end. Once they figure that out, I think the sky's the limit for this team.
And just a quick look at the next few games for Indiana. Of course, there'll be a couple of long stretches between games now that you have finals coming up for Indiana and, of course, Christmas break. But they'll take on Chattanooga next Saturday, and then a week after that, they'll take on Winthrop the following Saturday on the 29th, and then they'll re-enter conference play for the remainder of the season with Rutgers on January 2nd at home. They'll go on the road to Penn State after that, and then they'll play their first former Pac-12 team in USC at home on January 8th. So that's just kind of your quick look ahead at the next 5 games for Indiana basketball. And you're not really going to talk about what the record should be at this point. But either way, I agree with you. I do think there were some positive things to take away from this game. It's just weird looking at 85-68 and knowing that the game played out the way that it did. But also, if you really sat back and watched how the game played out, I truly believe that Indiana played well for a majority of this game. They just didn't do a lot of the right things down the stretch, which, again, that's part of the game, and they need to clean that stuff up. It's just very disappointing and frustrating to see how the game ended up playing out in the end, and I just hope to see things kind of turn around. And, like you mentioned, there's plenty of season left, and hopefully there's, we'll be talking about this a few weeks from now, or even a month from now, and this is a more cleaned up, polished Indiana team.
Yeah, and there's obviously, I don't expect them, knock on wood or whatever, I don't expect them to lose the next 2 games. They'll go into Big Ten play 10-3, and I probably just totally jinxed them there. But they'll go into the Big Ten play 10-3, so you got 10 wins right off the bat, and for the most part, all the wins that they've got have been pretty convincing. So they haven't struggled against the teams that, for the most part, I'm not saying there hasn't been struggles, but for the most part, they haven't struggled against the teams that they shouldn't be struggling against. They're taking care of business when they need to. For them to take that next step, and I've harped on it a lot here, it's just defense. They just got to lock down on defense, and they got to figure things out. This Indiana team is really weird, man. It's probably one of the more complicated puzzles you could put together when it comes to it, because the talent's there, and you think you have one puzzle piece that fits, and then all of a sudden, maybe this isn't the right one. You know what I mean? So they're going to figure it out. I think they're very, very close to figuring out. Starts on the defensive end and just letting the offensive game come, and just we'll just see what happens. But take care of business the rest of the month of December, and then get ready for Big Ten play and start getting some wins there.
Hoosiers lose by 17 on the road tonight to Nebraska, 85-68. Once again, their record now moves to 8-3, 1-1 in the Big Ten, and they'll be back in action next Saturday against Chattanooga, the day after Indiana's college football playoff matchup with Notre Dame at Simon Scott Assembly Hall. Kyler, appreciate you chatting about the game as always, and we'll do this again, I guess, a week from now. Maybe, I don't know. It'll be the morning after a football game. We'll see how that goes.
We'll see. We might be a little tired, so
we'll see.
We'll see.
This has been another edition of the HoosierIllustrated.com Indiana basketball postgame wrap-up show. Be sure to subscribe on YouTube. Check out In Touch with Indiana Sports. Check out Talking About the Hoosiers. We also have all the postgame pressers anytime they get released, and all sorts of other good things. So appreciate you tuning in, and we'll be back again next time.